The Midnight Confession. Chapter 1. The Visitor. Father Gabriel sat in the dimly lit confessional, the only sound the soft flicker of a candle dancing on the edge of its wick. It was a quiet night, one of those evenings where the weight of the world's sins seemed to be asleep. He sighed, feeling the solitude creep into his bones, when the creaking of the church's heavy wooden door shattered the silence. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight. Rarely did anyone come to confess at this hour. The door of the confessional opened, and a figure cloaked in darkness slipped inside. Father Gabriel could only see the outline of a man, shrouded in a long coat, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. The man sat heavily as if burdened by an invisible weight. There was a pause, a moment where the silence between them felt like a void, deep and consuming. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low and rasping as though dragged from the depths of some abyss. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Gabriel straightened, his heart quickening with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. "How long has it been since your last confession, my son?" The man hesitated. "Too long," he murmured, his words carrying an air of sorrow and desperation. "I've done something terrible." Gabriel's practiced calm began to waver. He had heard many confessions over the years, but something in the man's tone sent a chill down his spine. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "No sin is beyond God's forgiveness. What troubles you so deeply?" The stranger drew a shaky breath as if gathering the courage to speak. I have blood on my hands, Father." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Gabriel felt his breath catch. He had heard confessions of murder before, but this time it was different. The air seemed to grow colder, the candlelight flickering as if caught in a sudden draft. "Whose blood?" Gabriel asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a long silence. The man shifted in his seat, and Gabriel could almost hear his heartbeat, loud and frantic. When the man finally spoke, his voice was almost too soft to hear. "My wife's." The confession hit Gabriel like a punch to the gut. He sat back, his mind racing. Murder was a grave sin, but the murder of one's spouse, it was unthinkable. "Why?" Gabriel managed to ask, his voice tight. The man's voice cracked. "It was an accident, I swear. I didn't mean to hurt her, but she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't stop screaming." Father Gabriel's grip tightened on the edge of his seat. "Screaming? Screaming about what?" The man's breathing grew labored, his words coming out in a rush. "She found out. She found out about the money, the lies. She threatened to leave, to take everything. I couldn't let her ruin me, Father. I just wanted her to be quiet." Gabriel felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. This man was unraveling before him, and with it, the story of a life destroyed by greed and fear. But there was something more, something unsaid, lurking beneath the surface of the man's confession. Gabriel sensed it, a dark secret waiting to be revealed. "Tell me everything," Gabriel urged. "God is listening." The man let out a low, anguished groan. "It didn't stop there," he whispered. "After she died, I couldn't let anyone find out. I had to make sure." Father Gabriel's heart pounded. "Make sure of what?" The man's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "I buried her, Father. Buried her in the woods behind our house. But now she's back." Gabriel's blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man continued, his voice trembling with terror. "Every night I hear her, scratching at the walls, whispering my name. She won't leave me alone, Father. She wants revenge." The confessional was filled with a suffocating silence, as if the very walls of the church were holding their breath. Gabriel stared at the shadowed figure, trying to find his voice, trying to make sense of the horror that had just been confessed. But before he could speak, the man's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "And now, Father, now she's coming for you." Chapter 2. The Warning. Father Gabriel sat frozen in the confessional, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him like a physical force. Outside, the wind howled through the ancient trees surrounding the church, its eerie wail a fitting soundtrack to the terror that now gripped his heart. He struggled to find his voice, to respond to the man's ominous statement. Why would she come for me?" The man shifted again, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was struggling under an unbearable burden. "Because you're the only one who can save me, Father. You're the only one who can stop her." Gabriel's mind raced, grappling with the gravity of what he had just heard. "Stop her? Oh, what do you mean?" The man's breath hitched, a sound that was half a sob, half a sigh. "I don't know. But she's angry, Father. She's furious, and she's getting stronger. Every night, the noises get louder, the whispers clearer. She's trying to break through, from wherever she is." A shiver ran down Gabriel's spine. The man's confession was spiraling into something far darker and more terrifying than anything he had ever encountered. He had heard tales of hauntings, of restless spirits seeking revenge, but those were stories, myths meant to scare children. This, however, felt all too real. "What does she say when she whispers your name?" Gabriel asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart was anything but. The man hesitated, and for a moment, Gabriel thought he might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice that trembled with fear, he said, "She tells me that she's waiting, that she's coming for me, and that she won't stop until she's had her revenge." Father Gabriel swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic in his chest. He was a man of faith, sworn to protect the souls in his care, but this was beyond anything he had ever been trained for. How could he fight something that wasn't even alive? "Listen to me," Gabriel said, forcing authority into his voice. "You need to pray. Ask for God's forgiveness. We can do this together, right now. I'll help you." The man shook his head violently. "It's too late for that, Father. She's already here." The finality in the man's tone sent a wave of dread crashing over Gabriel. He felt utterly helpless, unsure of how to proceed. But before he could formulate a response, the church was suddenly plunged into darkness. The candle that had been burning in the confessional flickered out, leaving them both in pitch black. Gabriel's heart skipped a beat, and he heard the man gasp beside him. The wind outside grew louder, its mournful wail now joined by the sound of something scratching at the church doors. It was faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but it grew louder and more insistent with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Gabriel nodded, even though the man couldn't see him. He heard it too, the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against wood, slow and deliberate as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. The man began to tremble, his fear palpable in the confined space of the confessional. "She's here, Father. She's here." Gabriel's mind raced as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Was this some kind of test? A trial of faith? Or had he truly stepped into a nightmare from which there was no escape? He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some comfort, some reassurance, but before he could, the church doors flew open with a deafening crash. A blast of icy wind tore through the sanctuary, snuffing out the last remaining candles and plunging the entire church into darkness. The man let out a choked cry, and Gabriel felt his own heart seize with terror. Something was in the church, something unseen but undeniably present. The air was thick with a malevolent energy that sent every instinct in Gabriel's body screaming to flee. But he couldn't leave. He had to help this man, had to face whatever horror had followed him into this sacred space. Gathering every ounce of courage, Gabriel reached for the rosary around his neck, clutching it tightly in his hand. "Lord, protect us," he whispered, his voice shaking. The scratching stopped. The church was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that suffocates, that fills every corner with dread. Gabriel strained to listen, every muscle in his body tensed for whatever was to come next. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, a voice that was not the man's but something far more sinister. "Father Gabriel?" Chapter 3. The Revelation. Father Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. The voice that called his name was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight of malice that sent a shiver down his spine. He gripped the rosary tighter, his knuckles white as he tried to steady his racing heart. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew the answer, but he needed to hear it, needed to confront whatever was haunting this night. The darkness seemed to thicken around him, pressing in from all sides. The man beside him was silent now, as if he had been swallowed by the shadows. Gabriel strained to hear any sound, any movement, but there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the faint echo of his own breathing. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Father Gabriel, do you believe in redemption?" Gabriel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had devoted his life to the belief that no soul was beyond saving, that redemption was possible for even the most lost. But in this moment, surrounded by darkness and fear, those convictions felt distant and fragile. "Yes," he answered, forcing strength into his voice. "I believe in redemption. I believe that God's mercy is boundless." A low, mocking laugh echoed through the church, cold and hollow. "Then why do you fear me, Father? Why do you tremble in the presence of the one you claim can be saved?" Gabriel felt his blood run cold. The voice was playing with him, toying with his faith, and he knew that whatever it was not of this world. He took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage that had always come so easily in the past. "I do not fear you," he lied, his voice wavering. "I fear for the soul you've come to claim." The laughter stopped abruptly, and for a moment the church was deathly silent. Then the voice spoke again, but this time it was different, softer, almost sorrowful. "You should fear for your own soul, Father, for you too have sinned." Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. The voice seemed to pierce through his very being, exposing the doubts and fears he had tried so hard to bury. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, its tone dripping with dark knowledge. "You think you're safe, that your faith will protect you. But you've doubted, haven't you? You've questioned your own worth, your own place in God's plan." Gabriel's grip on the rosary loosened as the word struck a chord deep within him. It was true. He had doubted, had questioned his own faith, especially in recent years as he witnessed the suffering and evil in the world. He had wondered if he was truly doing God's work, or if he was just a man trying to find meaning in a world filled with darkness. "I am only human," Gabriel whispered, his voice filled with anguish. "I struggle like everyone else." The voice chuckled softly, a sound that was both pitying and cruel. "You struggle, but you also fail. You've turned your back on those who needed you most. You've let your fear, your doubt, consume you." Gabriel felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart heavy with guilt. The voice was right. He had failed, had let his own insecurities cloud his judgment, had pushed away those who came to him for guidance because he feared he couldn't help them. "And now," the voice continued, "you will pay the price for your failures. She is coming, Father. She is coming for you because you couldn't save her. You couldn't save them." Gabriel's mind spun with confusion and terror. "Oh, who is she?" he demanded, though deep down he feared he already knew the answer. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps echoing through the church. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer with each passing second. Gabriel turned towards the sound, but the darkness was impenetrable, hiding whatever was approaching. He could hear the man beside him breathing heavily now, as if he was struggling against some unseen force. Gabriel reached out, trying to find him in the darkness, but his hand grasped only empty air. The footsteps stopped, and the church was plunged into an unbearable silence once more. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to hear, to see anything in the pitch-black darkness. And then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her face pale and ghastly, her eyes hollow and filled with a cold, unrelenting fury. She was dressed in a tattered white gown, stained with dirt and blood, her hair hanging in tangled, wet strands around her face. She looked like something that had crawled out of the grave, and perhaps she had. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat as the woman stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He recognized her. Though he had never met her before, he knew who she was. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, what do you want from me?" The woman stopped just a few feet away, her eyes boring into his. "You failed him, Father," she said, her voice like ice. "You failed my husband, and now you will pay for it." Gabriel shook his head, confusion and fear clouding his thoughts. "I don't understand, how did I fail?" The woman's expression twisted into one of anger and pain. "You let him drown in his sins. You let him fall into darkness, and now he's lost forever. and it's your fault." Gabriel's heart ached with guilt, though he didn't fully understand what she was accusing him of. He wanted to plead with her, to tell her that he had done everything he could, but the words stuck in his throat. "Now," she whispered, her voice filled with cold resolve, "you will join him in the darkness." Before Gabriel could react, the woman lunged at him, her hands outstretched as if to grab hold of his very soul. He cried out, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the wrath of the dead. Chapter 4. The Descent. Father Gabriel's scream echoed through the empty church, his voice a raw, desperate cry for help that went unanswered. The woman's cold hands closed around his throat, her grip like iron, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He struggled, his hands clawing at hers, but she was unnaturally strong, her strength fueled by rage and sorrow. "Please," he gasped, his vision darkening as the air was forced from his body. "Please, forgive me." But the woman's expression remained cold and unyielding, her eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to consume her from the inside out. "There is no forgiveness for you, Father," she hissed. "Only the darkness, and the pain you caused." Gabriel's strength ebbed away, his body growing weaker with each passing second. The darkness at the edges of his vision closed in, and for a moment he thought he might succumb to it, that this was how it would all end, strangled by a ghost in the very church where he had once found solace. But just as the last bit of air was about to leave his lungs, the woman released him, shoving him backward with such force that he crashed into the confessional wall. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, his hands clutching at his bruised throat. He looked up at the woman, fear and confusion warring within him. Why had she let him go? What did she want from him? The woman stood over him, her expression cold and unreadable. "You will feel what he felt," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You will experience the torment of the damned, and you will understand." Before Gabriel could respond, the church began to change around him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening until they were almost tangible. The air grew thick and stifling, and the once sacred space was now filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Gabriel struggled to his feet, his body trembling from the encounter with the woman. He tried to make sense of what was happening, but his mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. This couldn't be real, it had to be some kind of hallucination, a nightmare born from his own guilt and doubt. But the pain in his throat, the coldness of the woman's touch, it had all been too real. "Lord, help me," he whispered, clutching his rosary as if it were a lifeline. But the words felt hollow, as if they had no power here. The woman began to move, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze never leaving Gabriel's. "You took everything from him, Father. His faith, his hope, even his life. Now it's your turn." Gabriel shook his head, backing away from her, his heart pounding in his chest. I didn't take anything from him. I didn't even know him." The woman's expression twisted into a bitter smile. "But you did. You were the one who was supposed to save him. You were his last chance, and you failed." The words struck Gabriel like a physical blow, the weight of them pressing down on him with unbearable force. He had always prided himself on being a good priest, on helping those who came to him in their darkest moments. But now, faced with this accusation, he began to doubt everything he had ever believed. Had he truly failed this man? Had he let him fall into despair, into darkness, without even realizing it? I didn't know," Gabriel stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "I didn't know." The woman's eyes flashed with anger. "Ignorance is no excuse, Father. You were supposed to guide him, to show him the light. But instead, you left him to wander in the shadows, and now those shadows have claimed him." Gabriel's legs gave out beneath him, and he sank to his knees, his body shaking with fear and guilt. The woman's words cut deep, each one a dagger to his soul. He had tried so hard to be a good priest, to do God's work, but now he was faced with the possibility that he had failed in the most crucial task of all. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." But the woman showed no mercy. She loomed over him, her presence dark and oppressive, as if she were the embodiment of his own sins. "Sorry isn't enough," she said coldly. "You must atone, and you will. You will suffer as he did, feel the despair that he felt. and only then will you truly understand. Gabriel's heart clenched in terror as the woman reached out towards him again, her fingers brushing against his forehead. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if he were about to be pulled into an abyss from which there was no return. "Please," he begged, his voice a choked sob. "Please, I'll do anything." The woman's cold smile was the last thing he saw before the darkness engulfed him completely. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. When Father Gabriel awoke, he was no longer in the church. The air around him was thick and heavy, filled with an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into his very soul. He tried to move, but his limbs were sluggish, as if weighed down by an invisible force. He struggled to his feet, his mind reeling from the sudden shift in his surroundings. The ground beneath him was soft and uneven, like the earth of a freshly dug grave. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that he was standing in a dense, fog-covered forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the fog that clung to the ground was thick and suffocating. The air was cold, biting into his skin, and he felt a chill settle deep in his bones. Panic surged through him as he realized where he was. The woods behind the man's house, the place where he had buried his wife. But how had he gotten here? Was this some kind of nightmare, a twisted vision sent to torment him? Or had he truly been transported to this place by some malevolent force? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement in the fog. Gabriel's heart raced as he turned towards the noise, his eyes straining to see through the thick mist. At first he saw nothing, only the swirling fog and the shadowy outlines of the trees. But then, slowly, a figure began to emerge from the fog. A woman, her form pale and ghostly, her tattered gown billowing around her as she moved. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. The woman from the church, the spirit of the man's wife. She glided towards him with an eerie grace, her eyes fixed on him with a cold, unrelenting gaze. Gabriel's mind screamed at him to run, to flee from this place of death and despair, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, trapped by her gaze, unable to move. The woman stopped just a few feet away from him, her expression one of cold determination. "You understand now, don't you, Father?" she asked, her voice echoing through the fog. "You understand the pain you've caused, the lives you've destroyed." Gabriel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The woman's expression hardened. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you of your sins. You let him fall into despair, into darkness, and now you must face the consequences." Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of her words hit him. He had failed, not just as a priest but as a human being. He had allowed his own doubts, his own fears to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had let this man, this woman, slip into a darkness from which there was no escape. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The woman's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Sorry won't bring him back. Sorry won't undo the pain you've caused. But perhaps, there is still a way to atone." Gabriel looked up at her, hope flickering in his heart. "What can I do?" he asked, desperation lacing his voice. The woman stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "You must confront the darkness within yourself, Father. You must face the sins you've tried to bury, the doubts you've refused to acknowledge. Only then can you hope to find redemption." Gabriel's breath hitched in his throat as her words sunk in. He had spent so long running from his own fears, his own doubts, hiding behind his faith and his duty as a priest. But now there was no more running. He had to face the darkness, had to confront the part of himself that he had tried so hard to deny. "How?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How do I do that?" The woman reached out, her hand cold and ghostly as it brushed against his cheek. "You must go to the place where it all began, the place where you lost your way. Only there will you find the answers you seek." Gabriel's heart sank as he realized what she was asking of him. The place where it all began. The church, the confessional where he had first heard the man's confession, where his own doubts had been laid bare. He nodded, his resolve hardening. He had to do this, had to face whatever waited for him in that darkened church. It was the only way to atone for his sins, to find the redemption he so desperately sought. The woman's gaze softened, and for the first time, Gabriel saw a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "Remember, Father," she said softly, "redemption is not given, it is earned. And the path to it is long and difficult." Gabriel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand," he whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." The woman nodded, her form beginning to fade back into the fog. "Then go, Father. Go and face the darkness." Gabriel watched as she disappeared into the mist, her presence lingering like a ghostly echo in his mind. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come, and turned to make his way back through the fog-covered woods. His heart was heavy with fear and uncertainty, but beneath it all was a glimmer of hope, a hope that he could find redemption, that he could make amends for the pain he had caused. But as he walked through the darkness, the echoes of the woman's words rang in his ears, a constant reminder of the trials that lay ahead. The path to redemption would not be easy, but it was a path he was determined to follow, no matter where it led. Chapter 6. The Final Confession. The church loomed before Father Gabriel like a great, dark beast, its towering spires piercing the night sky. The wind howled around him as he approached the heavy wooden doors, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. This was the place where it all began, and now it would be the place where it ended. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing the doors open and stepping inside. The church was silent, save for the echo of his footsteps on the stone floor. The familiar scent of incense filled the air, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. As he walked towards the confessional, his eyes were drawn to the flickering candle that still burned on the altar, casting long shadows across the walls. The flame danced wildly as if struggling against an unseen force, and Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He reached the confessional and paused, his hand hovering over the door. This was where he had first heard the man's confession, where his doubts had been laid bare, and where his faith had begun to crumble. But now, he was here to confront those doubts, to face the darkness that had been growing inside him for far too long. With a deep breath, Gabriel opened the door and stepped inside. The confessional was just as he remembered it, small, cramped, with only a thin screen separating him from the penitent's side. He knelt down, clasping his hands together, and closed his eyes. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he whispered, his voice trembling. It felt strange to speak those words, to take on the role of the penitent rather than the confessor. But he knew that this was the only way to find the redemption he sought. "I have failed in my duties as a priest," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I allowed my own doubts and fears to cloud my judgment, to turn me away from those who needed me most. I was blind to their pain, deaf to their cries for help, and now I must face the consequences of my actions." The silence that followed his confession was heavy, suffocating. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for a response, for some sign that he had been heard. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on him from all sides. Then, just as he began to lose hope, a voice spoke from the other side of the screen. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "You seek redemption, Father Gabriel?" Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. The voice was not the deep, rasping voice of the man who had come to confess to him that night. No, this voice was different. It was the voice of the woman, the spirit that had haunted him through the woods and back to this very spot. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I seek redemption. I seek forgiveness for the sins I have committed, for the lives I have failed." The voice was silent for a moment, as if considering his words. Then it spoke again, its tone gentle but firm. "Redemption is not easily won, Father. It requires more than just words. It requires action, sacrifice, and the willingness to face the darkness within yourself." Gabriel nodded, though he knew the spirit could not see him. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I am ready to do whatever it takes." The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. Gabriel's heart pounded as he waited, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt as if the walls of the confessional were closing in on him, as if the very air around him was thickening with each passing second. Then suddenly the door to the confessional creaked open, and Gabriel was enveloped in a wave of cold, bitter air. He turned, his eyes widening in shock as the figure of the woman appeared before him, her form barely more than a shadow in the dim light. She stepped inside the confessional, her cold gaze fixed on him. "There is one more thing you must do, Father," she said, her voice low and commanding. "One final act of atonement." Gabriel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What is it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The woman's eyes bored into his, her expression unreadable. "You must confess your own sins, Father. Not just to me but to those you have wronged. You must seek forgiveness not just from God, but from the people whose lives you have failed to save." Gabriel's heart sank as he realized what she was asking of him. He had spent so long hiding from his own guilt, burying his doubts beneath layers of faith and duty. But now there was no more hiding. He had to face the truth, had to confront the darkness within himself. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will do it," he said, his voice steady. "I will confess my sins, and I will seek forgiveness from those I have wronged." The woman's gaze softened, and for the first time, Gabriel saw a glimmer of something like approval in her eyes. "Then you may yet find the redemption you seek," she said quietly. "But remember, Father, it is a long and difficult path, and you must be prepared to face the consequences of your actions." Gabriel nodded again, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with pain and regret. But it was a road he had to walk, for it was the only way to atone for the sins he had committed, the lives he had failed to save. The woman stepped back, her form beginning to fade into the shadows. "Go now, Father Gabriel," she whispered. "Go and find your redemption." Gabriel watched as she disappeared into the darkness, her presence lingering in the air like a ghostly echo. He took a deep breath, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination, and stepped out of the confessional. The church was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the night lifting slightly as he made his way towards the altar. The flickering candle burned brighter now, its flame steady and strong as if it too had found a renewed sense of purpose. Gabriel knelt before the altar, his heart heavy with the burden of what he had to do. He bowed his head, whispering a final prayer for guidance, for strength, and for the courage to face the darkness within himself. And as he rose to his feet, he knew that his journey was just beginning. Subscribe for more spine-tingling stories and share your thoughts on The Midnight Confession in the comments below.